Hi, my name is Richard Broome. I was a teacher and a lecturer and a professor at La Trobe University for 30 years. I taught largely Indigenous history, but also migration history, Australian history generally. In retirement, I've become a member of the RHSV's Council and Publications Committee, editor of its journal with my colleague Judy Smart. And I am now president of the society. So it's a very fulfilling role in community history, but I'm still involved with an ARC project with La Trobe University, a very innovative one, about Indigenous history and creating a set of documents which are actually collected from the perspective of First Nations people. So we're trying to do something different to create this big documentary series. So I'm very involved in history still, even though I'm supposed to be retired.
My name's Judith Smart. I'm a historian. I used to teach history at RMIT University many years ago. I retired about 15 years ago. And ever since then, I've been doing research with Australian Research Council grants, and I've been editing the Victorian Historical Journal. And now with Richard, but I've been doing it on and off with other people over the years. And I've kept my engagement and role in history going for a long time. I'm on the working party of the Australian Dictionary of Biography, as is Richard. I am involved not just in the RHSV, but on the History Council of Victoria. I chair the Old Treasury Building Management Committee. And so I continue to do a lot of history work. I'm a member of my local historical society, which is Richmond and Burnley, but I also belong to the Apollo Bay one and the Nepean Historical Society. So I'm engaged in community history as well. Well, the Royal Historical Society of Victoria is the second oldest of the major historical societies throughout Australia. It's 115 years old. We had a celebration of the 115th anniversary this year. The journal began in 1909, so it's been going for a long time, and it was known as the Victorian Historical Magazine, but now it's the it's the Victorian Historical Journal, which is the journal of the Royal Historical Society of Victoria. The society became royal in 1952, I think, and we've been royal ever since. But the journal, at least, is just the Victorian Historical Journal. Richard and I have been co-editing it since 2017, and I have edited it on and off since 2005, with people and by myself at various times too.
And it's over the years got a lot larger as a journal. It was quite a slim volume back in the 20th century, but in the last sort of 10, 20 years it's become much more substantial. It now has an editorial board overseeing it, and it has all the compliance with the ethics and what journals should be doing to look after their authors, but look after the truth-telling that a journal does. And we are cited by Web of Science and other bodies, including Informit, which is RMIT's own citation index. So it is, I think, gaining more respect than it ever did, and it's certainly, we publish both the work of academics, particularly young academics who are looking to make their way in journal writing, and Judy and I both also edited the Australian Historical Studies, which is the foremost journal of Australian history, and I think through our experience we're very willing to offer help to young scholars producing their first article. So I guess we do a bit of value adding, which I think is really important to mentor young people. But the journal is also a bit of a hybrid because it's also a society journal. So we publish our distinguished lectures. We have about 6 at the RHSV each year to do with Indigenous history, women's history, law, and law and history, social history. And so we have begun to publish those in recent years because I think that really is an important thing to do. Those lectures are usually given by quite eminent people, and it mightn't be a crafted piece of work like a journal article, but it's usually a very interesting piece of work. So we've been publishing those. We publish academic articles that are double-blind refereed for academics, but we also publish what we call historical notes, which are shorter pieces, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 words, and a lot of our members send these pieces in. Something's buzzing in their heads about history, and they write it up. They're usually very good and interesting pieces of work, and we publish them as well, but they don't go through the refereeing process.
We also review books on Victorian history, so we usually have something like about 10 reviews in each copy of the journal, and they're selected for us by our reviews editor and by the one of the members of the committee, the publications committee, who selects them from books that are given to the RHSV to look through for History News, which is another publication the Society produces 5 times a year or 6 times a year.
And we come out as a journal twice a year.
Yes.
And it's part of the membership of the Society, so $95 I think at the moment it is to become a member. You get the journal and you get History News free as well. So, you know, I think that we provide a lot of information to the community history sector across Victoria.
We've sometimes produced special issues too, thematic issues. For example, the 150th anniversary of the Education Department in Victoria. We held a conference and then published the articles, published as articles, some of the conference papers that were given. And we also, with the anniversary, the centenary anniversary of the outbreak of World War I, we had a conference and published the papers from that too. So we tend to do that occasionally, you know, thematic issues, and sometimes we have smaller themes within the journals. For example, the Governor at the moment is running a series of sessions on Victorian history, and she's run 2 of them so far, and the 3rd is coming up this week. The first one was on the gold rushes, the second one was on Federation, and the 3rd one, which is on Thursday this week, is on protest movements of the 1960s and 70s. And we proposed to the Governor that we would publish the lectures and the commentaries on them in the journal. So the first series is coming out in the December issue of the journal. So we'll do things like that too, try and provide, you know, a public record of useful events. For example, this year is the 100th anniversary of the Victorian Heritage Register, and we had a session at the RHSV where people talked about the Heritage Register, and we're going to publish some of the papers from that, and perhaps some papers that weren't given there at the end of next year.
So the journal is actually a collection of you know, historical material about Victoria, and that's part of our purpose as the RHSV. The Royal Historical Society has the purpose of collecting and protecting information about Victoria's past in a diverse way. We're trying to broaden our interests from white pioneers to look at multicultural society, multicultural element, and Indigenous First Nations history. So we publish a broadening amount of themes, and we feel the journal over the years is creating a real collection of knowledge about Victoria. So it's really, we have a collection, of manuscripts, we have a collection of images, and now we have a collection of historical writing about Victoria. And we've just, as of this December issue, created a Victorian History Hall of Fame, whereby we want to remind people about the important historians who've written about Victoria in the past and in the present. So we've got a posthumous section. We're going to have 3 people announced in the journal that created a very important historical record of Victoria. And also we have 2 living historians that are the inaugural first 2. So we hope that this makes people much more aware of who are the significant historians in Victoria's emerging story of itself.
We've tried to broaden the audience since Richard and I have been editing the journal. By and large, it was published for members of the society, but we're trying to make it a general Victorian history journal. It is the second oldest history journal in the country, after the Royal Australian Historical Society one, which is really New South Wales, not Australia-wide. But ours is the second oldest in the country. And so we're trying to make that more obvious, just in terms of our contribution to the understanding of Victorian history in particular. So we want to broaden the audience beyond the membership of the journal. But at the same time, it's important for us to make it relevant to the membership. And the membership of the RHSV it's over 1,000 individual members, but there are also over 340 historical societies that are affiliated to the Royal Historical Society. And the journal goes to all of those societies. It can go digitally or it can go in hard copy. Which means that it's got a pretty broad reach, and we'd like to make sure that the people who receive it, whether they're local historians or community historians, whether they're academics or young historians, whether they're individual members of the society or just Victorians who are interested in history, all find something of use and interest in the journal.
And I think one of our purposes now is to advance culture. And we feel as though we're doing it through the journal, through our collection, through our exhibitions, through the events we run, but also through our sponsorship with the Public Record Office of the Victorian Community History Awards, which have been going now for 26 years. And every year we have maybe 150 entries of books, walking tours, a whole range of media. But essentially it started off with history books, and we have judging panels that award 10 prizes across those 150 entries. And so we really are trying to lift up the whole history sector in Victoria and to help those societies to publish their work and to get recognised. And then we have a bookshop where they can sell their material, and there's very few places where you can find a whole range of historical works about Victoria, but our bookshop does that. We're online and we're face-to-face because we live in an army drill hall just up the road near the top of Franklin Street on the corner of Beckett and William Street opposite the Flagstaff Gardens. And it's a fascinating building. It's a 1939 army drill hall, and it sort of works for us at the moment.
And it's open from 9 to 5 practically every day, except for the main holidays. So we encourage people to come and visit. We have a lot of lecture activities, both during the day and in the evenings. And so it's open to people to come and listen to, talk about, think about a whole variety of history as it relates to Victoria. I have a slightly different background from Richard in all of this because teaching at RMIT, there weren't very many of us who were actually in history. We didn't have a history department as such. And so I ended up teaching British history, Australian history, American history, Chinese history, Indonesian history, Vietnamese history, Japanese history, and a range of thematic histories as well. But my research area is Australian history. And I'm particularly passionate about the early 20th century and about the World War I period and about women's political activism and protest movements, both for conservative women and radical women, up until about the middle of the 20th century.
Yes, I was lucky in that as a young historian, I took a job at La Trobe University and I entered probably the biggest department in Australia at the time, and I would say the best. We had over 40 lecturers in history. We taught everything in history except ancient. Australia's only Pulitzer Prize winner was teaching there at La Trobe, Rhys Isaacs, who won his prize for a beautiful book on colonial Virginia just before the American Revolution. So I was so privileged to be to be listening, working with, teaching with a group of very talented historians who many of them became very well known later. So I was lucky, and therefore I went there to teach Australian history, and as it turned out, Indigenous history from the get-go. One of my colleagues, John Hurst, had created this course, the first in Australia of any university, in 1972, to teach Indigenous history. When I arrived in 76, he said, teach it, and when he came back from extended leave 3 years later, he said, keep teaching it. So I taught Indigenous history for a long time in various iterations, but I also taught migration history. I taught a British Australian history course, which was just a wonderful course, because we can only understand Australia if we understand its origins. And that at the time was British history and Irish history. Now there are many, many histories that help us to understand Australia, and of course First Nations history is so important today to understanding who we are and where we came from. But I was very lucky to have that sort of entry into the world of history, and it was just so valuable to sit and listen to colleagues who taught in different disciplines: Mexican history, Aztec history, British history, and listen to how they approached it.
One of the interesting things I think is that, for seeing Richard and I came from quite different sorts of history teaching environments, that we also related to other historians who were working in different universities in different sort of areas throughout the state, and particularly the Melbourne area. So I found a huge amount of value out of joining, for example, the Melbourne Feminist History Group, which has been operating since the 1980s and is still going today. And it provided a research network for me that I just was lacking in my own particular environment. But we also had a range of other organisations that we could go and join and participate in conversations. I belonged to the Melbourne China Studies Group for a while, which was really interesting too. And we had the History Institute of Victoria, which had representatives from all of the universities, and then became the History Council of Victoria, which has representation not just from the universities but from a range of other history institutes and organisations, including the RHSV. And then, of course, there's the RHSV itself. So those sorts of extra university groups, I think, provided a community of historians that I certainly would have otherwise been lacking.
And history was very strong across the whole university sector, particularly in the late 20th century, 1970s, 80s, 90s. So a lot of university departments were strong and big, unlike today, where history has had to share the pie with many other new disciplines, media studies, you could name a whole range of them, that didn't exist when history departments grew up. But we did get together in many ways. One of them was through the Australian Historical Association, would hold an annual conference, and so we all got to meet each other. But there were quirky ways too. In Victoria, there was a thing run out of Melbourne University at first called the History Safari, and that was to go and talk to Year 12 students in the country, because city Year 12s got access to lectures that were given by various bodies. Country students did not. So we'd pile in the car and drive up to Swan Hill or Warrnambool, and you'd be with colleagues from Monash and Melbourne and whatever, and all the way you'd talk shop as partly, what's happening in your area, etc. So it was a fantastic way of being collegial and helping Year 12s.
And it's still being run today through the History Council.
Exactly.
The government didn't fund it for this year, but we managed to get some private funding to keep it going, and we've also managed to convert some of it into digital form now too, so that students who are in country areas, as well as some in the Melbourne area, can access materials through podcasts and and recordings.
But it's not as fun because you
No,
don't
that's
get any
right.
fun to get in the
But
car together and
yeah.
talk all the way and have dinner with each other at night.
But we still do that visitation. So
yeah.
we go to Bendigo or Ballarat or
Yes.
Sale or Bairnsdale and take a group of people up there. Perhaps not as big as it used to be, but we still try to do that personal interaction as well.
Well, I think history's one of the great ways of knowing self and knowing others. To study history is to see where you fit in the human stream. And even if it's you look just at Australian history, you're fitting into the context of what's happened over the last 6 or 7 generations. And now we can go back and study deep time and see what is below the surface across Australia. But if you do other periods of history in other places, then you actually get to understand others, because to do history well, you have to read texts from the past, you had to try and analyse and understand them, and that means you can't do it, but you're trying to get into the minds of someone else. And that has many layers. There's often the language has changed, or you might be working in a foreign language, but even if it's English, English has changed over the last couple of 100 years. Terms change. So you've got to work hard to get back into that period. But once you do, you start to understand the lives of others in very different places and contexts. And I think it builds empathy. I think that's one of the things that students need. This is an age of, in many ways, self, and we need to see how others are travelling, what they've experienced, and there's no better way than history to do that, is it, Judith?
Absolutely.
Tell us about your women rioters in the First World War and the advocates for change.
Well, indeed, and I think that it's really important that if people are going into all sorts of work, not just into teaching history, because there are so few jobs left in teaching history now, but if you're going into into the public service, into jobs in any industry, into jobs in library or in the community, you need to have skills such as being able to do research and to ask questions and to empathise, and then to be able to make sense of it, to put it in some sort of order, to be able to construct arguments from it, to be able to see logical sequences, and then to be able to present it in such a way that other people can understand what you're saying and can get some sort of inspiration and some further ideas about ways in which they might take policy or objectives of an organisation into different sorts of directions. So I think that history is really good training for general human interaction, because there is no better way of coming to some sort of understanding of where people are coming from and ways in which they can cooperate and do things together rather than just operate in a situation of conflict.
And it's not easy. It's not just about, as we always thought, dates and events, but it's what those dates and events mean, and how that they created actions in people, how they created change, because history's interested in texts, understanding what people said in the past, the context of when that was said, but also about how that created change, because, societies do change through time, and historians are interested in why that's so. And I don't think you can learn about the present or the future particularly from history, but I think it gives you a little bit of an advantage of understanding what's happened before and maybe what might happen again. But certainly, understanding our own world is just one of the key things that history can do.
Understanding people's values and the context that they've come from too, so that when you're speaking to people or reading what they're saying, you're doing it with some sort of background knowledge of where they're coming from, so that you can engage in a meaningful sort of conversation with them that's not based on complete ignorance.
What's always fascinating to me is the people in the past looked pretty much like us. They might have dressed differently, but above all, they thought differently. And just think, for instance, 200 years ago, there were no votes for women. And that was totally accepted by society, even by many women at the time, but certainly by men. And that's been totally flipped. So historians are interested in how that happens, why that happens. And it makes us understand more about the world around us.
And why some people would have accepted that.
Exactly.
And regarded it as not particularly important to have the vote. For some women, for example, for many women, they believed that they could influence society in other ways, and that having the vote was a very minor way of doing that. Perhaps they were right. When I went through all of the syllabuses from pre-primary school through to the end of secondary school, I couldn't see much that was missing at all. The problem is that not everybody studies everything on that curriculum, that they'll only study little bits and pieces, and that students can stop studying history at all after they reach year 10, so that years 11 and 12 may be completely without any history. And even in the earlier years, it might be 1 or 2 classes a week and not much more than that. And it will often depend on what the teacher's interests are rather than what the student's interests are. So it's really hard to say what's missing because there's a lot there. It's just that it's not always all available all of the time. There are probably some things that Richard and I would say, perhaps different things, but perhaps some similar things that we think all students should know and study from Australian history at least, but perhaps even from international history too.
Yes, I think that I was very involved with Year 12 textbook writing in Victoria. Now, there's a few things to just give you some facts and figures. Victoria is the only state in Australia that teaches our own history at Year 12, at the senior level. And so I think that's an important thing to know. But so we created 4 textbooks to try and sustain and revive Australian history, because in recent years it's been suffering because most students do revolutions. I think they feel it's going to be more exciting. But those who actually do Australian history end up saying at the end of the year, "Miss, that was just so fantastic. I'm glad I did that." So the figures are, whereas 50% of students at Year 12 did history, and mostly that was Australian history 30, 40 years ago, now it's 10% do a history, but most of them do revolution. So 10% do history, 1% does Australian history. That's our own history. So I think that's pretty devastating, and I've been actively trying to turn that around. And there's now a terrific syllabus for Year 12. Students get to choose from 4 themes, either one on the environment, one on migration, one on the struggle for rights, and the other one on war and upheaval. So they choose 2 of those. And so even the students that are doing Australian history, the 700 or 800 that are doing it, are making choices and doing 2 themes. But that's wonderful. And most of them do struggle for rights, which I think is an extremely important thing about how democracy was won and expanded in Australia. And the other is about war and upheaval, which is sort of looking for the excitement of revolutions in the Australian context. And there's some fascinating, and they do the home front. They don't do the battlefield. They do the home front, and that's full of, debates about conscription, about who should serve in the war, or should we go to war, and what happens on the home front. And then later on, how people can enter the service that might be LGBTI, or how women can enter the army and the services. So there's lots of interesting controversies in that theme alone.
But it's such a pity that so few people do it.
Well, it is, because it's now a fantastic syllabus, much better than it ever was. And because they've got 4 themes, textbooks can be written. Instead of just a big sort of long choose what you want to do in Australian history, it targets certain things, but key themes, and allows textbooks to be created, which are great help to students.
It does mean that the vast majority of Victorian students and Australian students generally don't really study history beyond year 10. So it's, I guess one of the things that we perhaps need to consider is how we make those years really valuable and important in terms of students having a basic understanding of the main themes in Australian history and I think world history up to year 10. And that's a real challenge.
Well, you would hope that other disciplines that are taught in schools would teach the same skills, because I think they should be basic educational skills. History can do it well, I think. Others, I'm sure, can do it well too. What history offers above that is knowledge of yourself and past and your own society and how it works. You know, the social and political structures of Australian society can be better understood if you do Australian history and how the vote was won. People might respect voting more if they saw the struggle that people went through to get it.
I think that history also teaches research techniques too that some of the other subjects don't teach. In most subjects, you'll get some sort of form of oral history, ways of interviewing people and talking to them. In some subjects too, you'll get statistical stuff, looking at the way people can be counted and assessed numerically. But I think history has a particular value in terms of the variety of different sorts of research materials that we encourage people to look at. The documentary materials, how to read a newspaper, how to go hunting for government documents and to understand how they're framed and sorted. Working in libraries, in archives, so that you can go through a whole lot of materials that are quite different from the sorts of materials that are produced now, and how you can interpret them and understand them. And I think that those sorts of skills are really valuable if you're going to have citizens who can do proper research and can make informed decisions and argue an informed case.
You know, historians ask who created this document and why, and in what context. Well, they're the questions that will help young people distinguish between true and fake things on the internet.
Who says what to whom, through what channels, to what effect, and in what context?
Yes. I think at first it influenced it by indifference, because the colonial wars were hard fought. It was really a battle for the land by incoming settlers and the original owners. And that was the end game. Australia was a place of settlement. It wasn't an empire where people came and took human slaves or took resources. They were here to settle. So it was a struggle for the land, and this was acknowledged at first during the colonial period because it was so in people's faces. It was in the press all the time about violence and struggle. But then I think it got written out of history, and by the late 19th century, people were starting to say, you know, this was a peaceful settlement of a country. The whole violence was written away, and Aboriginal people were disparaged as savages of no account. And of course, by the time of Federation, the Constitution didn't really pay much attention to it. Indigenous people. It was seen to be a state's problem, and that problem was probably going to go away because their numbers were declining. So they were pretty much written out of history and Australian history until the 1960s and 70s, where a lot of young scholars started to get interested. And this was partly because Aboriginal people were starting to stand up and voice a protest for equal rights, and that was happening from the 1940s on. So historians caught that and paid attention and started to see this was an area to be researched. So Australian history since the 1960s and 70s have started to include First Nations stories. But at first, for the probably 30 years, it was done by white fellow historians. I'm one of those. I did that because no one else was doing it. Indigenous people were too busy fighting for rights, too busy surviving to begin to put pen to paper. And it's only in the last 10 to 15 years that people have been appointed to university in Indigenous studies or in history to teach Aboriginal history, and they're telling their own stories in their own way. I believe that we all should tell the stories. Because we've been bound together since 1788. The settlers were not going to go away, and so Australian history is now two stories. But for many years, only half of that story was told, but it's now being told, and I think that's making for a very vibrant history and a very vibrant understanding of our past, and something that enriches us. Well, until recently, the public generally didn't recognise frontier violence in any way at all, really. I think that's changing, but there's still a lot of gaps. First of all, I think people still don't have an understanding of how widespread it was. Now, it wasn't totally in that violence didn't happen all the time. There were comings together, there were adaptations on both sides, working together on both sides in many instances. But in the early colonial period, many areas were touched by violence, and it was quite significant. So I think that people don't understand the extent of it. Secondly, I think people don't understand its duration. And in any one place, it might have only happened for 1 or 2 years, depending on the terrain and the settlers, the nature of the settlers, the nature of Indigenous people, whether they were going to try and get along or not. But I think people don't appreciate that it happened in 1788, 89 at first, and the last violence was in the 1920s in the Kimberley and the Northern Territory. So it was a very long history of violence that was going across a moving frontier. So I don't think people understand that fully as well. And lastly, I think people don't really appreciate the trauma that this violence occurred. And I include myself in this. I think we now know much more about the impact of trauma in people's lives, from accidents, from violent incidents in the street, from family losses. Trauma is something that has to be dealt with and takes a long time. And so for a community that was presented with violent actions for a long time, or then the stories of what happened to their forebears, has meant that there's been intergenerational trauma. And that violence is, in more recent times, taken the form of the removal of children. That is a form of violence. Or another form of violence is what is said about people in terms of very strong language. We might call it racist language, where people are said to be this or that. They're stereotypes. And they're violent, because I'm sure if we all experience those words being thrown at us, we would feel that violence. So it's another form of aggression. So really, I think only in truth-telling, like recently in the Yurok Truth-Telling Commission in Victoria, there was a more public airing of what had happened in certain parts of the frontier, and hopefully a greater understanding from the public. And people shouldn't feel this happened in the past. The most important thing is we don't keep letting it happen in other forms of violence, be it aggressive language or removal of children into social welfare places or whatever. Well, I think Aboriginal people are very keen for other Australians to learn more about what happened in the past. And we can only do that through reading history or studying history or listening. So they're very keen for us to understand and acknowledge what happened in the past. But the other thing is, I think they want us to recognise the violences that are still being done today in terms of racial language, stereotyping, and not listening, and in many ways, government saying you have to do it this way. That hasn't always worked, and we know through closing the gap that we've taken a long time to make very little progress, and that's because there hasn't been enough involvement of Aboriginal people in this process, and that's now beginning to happen. Governments are beginning to see that maybe Aboriginal people can determine their own lives in this sense. And more recognition of Indigenous knowledge too. And now in fire prevention in Victoria, there's starting to be acknowledgement of the importance of cultural burning to reduce the massive firestorms that can be created. So there's been recently this week a report by the Human Rights Commission about racism and in the workplace and how it can be managed, and I recommend everyone look up that document, and it has key recommendations. Well, I think federation came out of a few concerns. One of them was business concerns, that here were rival colonies needing to get on better, needing to have better communications, better post and telegraph systems, better railway gauge systems that didn't have different widths in either state. So you had to get out at Albury and change trains because the train couldn't go all the way from Sydney to Melbourne because of the train gauge. So people were seeing from a business angle, there was gains to be made. Others were, I think, developing a sense of national identity. And this had been happening as early as the gold rushes, where a lot of people were coming and saying that really Australia is a pretty good damn place. It's a belly full. There's plenty of food and there's plenty of work and fresh air. And so they were writing home saying, it's not totally easy, but there's so many possibilities here. So this was developing a sense of a commitment to a new place. And I think by the late 19th century, you had groups like the Australian Natives Association who were calling for a united Australia. There were visionaries who were saying, look, we're one continent. We need to be one nation. And so there was this growing Australian national spirit, increased by the number of native-born people. Just as they grew up, they started to have attachment to place. So first of all, it's a business thing. Secondly, it's a national thing. But thirdly, I think we've got to recognise it's also a racial thing. And people like Alfred Deakin were saying, look, this has got to be a place for white people, and not just because of crude racism, but he thought that Australian living standards into the future would be undermined by migration of people from cultures that didn't have the same respect for, say, unionism or workers' rights or whatever. So there are a whole lot of things coming together in the 1890s that led people in Victoria and in other places as well, although New South Wales is a bit slow to get going, to lead them to believe we need to have a federation, we need to talk about this. So they had a series of national conventions, they had a series of votes, and people at that stage were writing poetry about Australia. So you can see at the grassroots level, while there's doubts in, is this going to cost us money? Is it going to be a good thing? There are other people saying we need to be a united country.
I'd add another element to that. One of the favourite terms at the time that was used to describe what they wanted to achieve was independent Australian Britons. So at one level, they wanted to be an independent nation. At another level, they wanted it to be British, and to be British in a context that was 3 months, sometimes 6 months away from Britain itself, and in an area that was completely strange, where we were surrounded by Chinese people, Indonesian people, all sorts of people who were not white, who were not of British background, and in a context too where other European powers were starting to compete with Britain for control of the seas and for control of the areas near Australia. So there was the threats coming from Germany. Earlier there'd been threats coming from France, and earlier still there'd been threats coming from the Dutch. So it was a case really of positioning Australia in an Asian area as an outpost of European and in particular British civilisation. And I think that was a really important element of federation as well, that if you could bring together the Australian British colonies, then you could make them much stronger, as opposed to not just the threat of the Asian peoples to our north, but also the competing European powers who saw Australia, or who might see Australia, as being a place where they could settle and take control too.
During the 1850s, in the gold rush period, people came from everywhere. There were diverse groups of Europeans, there were South Americans, there were Americans, and of course there were many Chinese diggers as well. So that gave Victoria and Melbourne a multicultural moment, if you like. But it was soon overlaid because there were discrimination acts against the Chinese, against their entry, or they had to pay taxes, whereas other settlers didn't. This is in the late 1950s. And so I think that multicultural moment was overlaid for a long time as Australia, as my colleague Judy Smart said, Australia desired to be independent Britons, Australian Britons, and very, very attached to empire for defence reasons and lots of things. So it really wasn't until the 1940s, when Australia hadn't been able to take any immigrants through the First World War, the Depression and the Second World War, that there was a population crisis. And so the government was desperate to get immigrants. Now, they wanted British immigrants, but they really couldn't at first get enough. There wasn't the shipping, there wasn't the programs in place, but they were able to take refugees from Northern and Eastern Europe who were in the UNRWA refugee camps, displaced by the events of the Second World War. So they agreed to take about 180,000, which was a very large intake in 1947 to 50, and most of them were non-British, and this had to be sold to the Australian people, but the government, Arthur Calwell, did a great job of this by pointing out Australia's population problem, that the refugee program would be managed by tying people to jobs for 2 years, filling the needs of Australian society for workers, because there was no unemployment in 1950, in the 1950s. Australians were desperate for labour. So that changed the face of Australia, if you like, because after that then a series of programs from Greece, Italy, Turkey as it's called today, other places brought immigrants, and they settled particularly in the cities, but also places like Mildura, but Melbourne took a large slice. So it started to bring this new injection of people with new attitudes, new ideas. At first they might have created tensions by clubbing together a bit, but that's natural, and eventually they moved out into other places, into the suburbs, and so they really changed Australian society, because At first Australia wanted to assimilate them all, but they realised they couldn't. And so they, in the end, had to develop a multicultural policy which gave respect to other cultures, other groups. And Al Grasby had this wonderful image. He said, it's like the family of the nation. Like, you're not the same as your brothers and sisters, but you get along with them. And that was the metaphor he used to promote multiculturalism in Australia. So I think thereafter we are a different Australia. If you walk the streets of Melbourne, if you look at the restaurants, if you look at any part of society, there's an imprint from a migrant group, and it enriches us all to have that, and we need to celebrate that diversity. And of course we're now beginning to celebrate First Nations people too, and the diversity they bring to enhance our culture.
Well, to start with, I think I would sort of reiterate what Richard has said about First Nations people. Women were always there. It doesn't matter what particular group that you're looking at or what particular historical context you're looking at. Women were there among First Nations people. Women were there among convicts. Women were there among the early settlers. Women were there among the gold rush migrants. And women may have been a minority over those periods of time right up until the end of the 19th century, but they were there and they were important and they were doing things. And they were also claiming rights. There were women during the gold rushes who were arguing that not only should the men be claiming rights as new citizens or new people in a country that they hoped where they would eventually become citizens, but women were claiming too the same sorts of rights. There were some women who actually claimed the right to vote, and when men first had the right to vote in Victoria in the 1860s, some women actually voted too because they forgot to exclude them. But then they realised that women had voted, and so they did exclude them from then on until a time when women's organisations got together and started to argue that they should have the vote. I think, though, if I'm talking about which events were made the beginnings of a feminist movement in Australia, I'd have to say it's urbanisation. So when you've got large numbers of people coming together in cities and they're all sort of rubbing up against one another and starting to realise that they have different sorts of interests, then I think that you start to see the beginnings of the emergence of women's movements. The thing is that it's a mistake to see them all as the same colour, basically, as seeing them all as about fights for the vote and fights for rights. They weren't. There were women's organisations, particularly in the late 19th century and well into the first half of the 20th century, whose main interest was morality, whose interest was stopping men drinking, whose interest was in having secure homes where they could bring up their children without the threat of drunken male violence. Some things don't change. And the earliest women's organisations in the cities were temperance organisations, ones that were aiming to restrict the right of men to go and drink in pubs. Were aiming to reduce hotel hours, and they eventually did, down to 6 o'clock closing. There were women's organisations who were saying that what we should be doing is making sure that women's obligations and women's activity in the homes are recognised and important. And that means not just votes for women, but it means recognition of the importance of protecting the domestic sphere and making sure that the income that men brought into the home was equally shared among all of the family, and that women had rights to parts of that income, and that that women who were working should also have the right to the same sorts of levels of pay as men, particularly if they were going to be bringing up children by themselves, which frequently happened, as it does now too. We find that I think when the women's organisations, women's movement starts to form, apart from the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the late 19th century, the main ones in the early 20th century are in fact organisations like housewives associations, and they were about consumer rights. They were about saying that women are important in the economy because they may not be the main body of workers, they may not be the main body of employers, but they are the main body of consumers. They're the ones who actually had to do the buying and the cooking and the looking after and managing the family finances. And so the housewives associations, and particularly in Victoria, and Victoria's very interesting in this regard because I think Victorians are joiners, and that means women are joiners as well. The Housewives Association grew to 75,000 by the late 1930s in Victoria alone. It was the biggest women's organisation in the country, if you don't actually count the Red Cross societies. And they're big, they're important, but they're mainly geared towards war. But the Housewives Associations really represented the interests of women as consumers. You find that too, that interestingly, I think if you look at the purely political organisations, the Women's Political Association gets a lot of crowd time if we're talking about publicity, and its leader, Vida Goldstein, is probably the best known feminist in Australia, apart from Rose Scott in New South Wales, but Vida Goldstein I think gets even more publicity than Scott did. And she's important, certainly she's important, and she followed through on the English feminist organisations' claims for the right to vote and the right to stand for Parliament and to be in the public sphere. But the biggest of the political organisations were the conservative ones. The Australian Women's National League had a membership of 54,000 by World War I. The Women's Political Association had about 500. So they're nowhere near each other in terms of comparable organisations. Where they did all start to gain some sort of power, if we want to talk in terms of power, was when they came together in the National Council of Women. And the National Council of Women had branches in all Australian states, and it eventually came together as a national organisation by 1930 as well. And they were able to then lobby on behalf of thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of women, rather than just a few from separate organisations. And it's surprising how often conservative and radical and temperance women and those who were concerned with charity organisations and those who were concerned with church organisations could come together on particular issues that they were concerned about. One of them, a particular one, and it obviously concerns women still today, was the security of the home, and particularly the security of women if men deserted and they no longer had an income. One of these organisations, when they came together, saw that they had a common interest in fighting for the rights of women to be able to claim from men a share of their income to bring up their children. And that was one of the major issues that they fought about and they fought for. And eventually, through various forms of marriage legislation, initially at the state level and then at the federal level, were able to gain those sorts of rights. They don't sound huge to us today because everybody's much more interested in the right to vote, but it's a real sort of measure of the security of women and of children. Those sorts of fights were probably more important in the long run, and still are today. They were fights that were concerned about not just income security, which was obviously extremely important, but also about security against violence. And again, domestic violence is an issue that is important today, and women's organisations have been arguing about domestic violence and ways of preventing it, including preventing having early closing and stopping men bringing alcohol into the home and coming home drunk. But it's become a lot more complicated as time has gone on, of course. But those sorts of movements, I think, were really important, and it's the fact that you have people living together in cities that makes those issues much more obvious than they would be otherwise. So I think urbanisation probably is one of the key issues that brought about feminist movements from the beginning of the 20th century. I think equality is really important, and equality in political sense and in an economic sense, and in a sense of representation right across the board. So it's a case of nothing about us without us. And unless you have women actually involved in decision making about issues that concern them, and that's most issues, then I don't think that we're going to progress very far. So one of the arguments that the domestic violence services movement has been making since the 1970s is that the main issue is one of power. And if women don't have the same sorts of equality of power as men, then there will always be problems. So I think power is a major issue, and I think acknowledgement of power and acknowledgement that women must be involved and engaged in all decisions and in all levels of society is crucial. Equality is another one, and again it's related to power. If you don't have economic equality, legal equality, and equality of access, then power becomes a problem. Power is compromised as well. So I think all of those issues are really important ones. I think, as Richard was talking about, the Australian history curriculum at VCE level does in fact cover a lot of this if students choose to take those particular options. The problem is, again, that so few students are taking Australian history at that level. So I would like to see more of these sorts of themes included in the junior history curriculum up to year 10. And I think it's important that they are, because that's when children are turning into adults, when we're finding the teen years and they're discovering each other and talking to each other and engaging with each other. Those things become really important for them to talk about and to think about and to know something about the historical context from which they've come. If they understand something about that historical context, then they may be, in fact, more understanding of one another, more tolerant of one another, more ready to ask questions of one another and to engage in conversation rather than conflict and competition. Well, in some ways, as I was saying, some of them are very much the same. They're about things like domestic violence, equality within marriage, about the rights of consumers, and the importance of recognising that quality and standard of living is an important part of women's rights. But at the same time, I think that we've got evolution from political rights, which have always been important, the right to vote, the right to stand for Parliament, and they took a long time to achieve. Victoria was the last state to give women the vote in 1908 and the last state to give women the right to stand for Parliament in 1924. But those aside, and they're important, I think that the issues that became more important by the 1960s and 1970s had to do with sexuality, and particularly had to do with birth control. And I think that the issues about birth control and the right to decide when you want to have children and if you and to be able to decide not to have children became the most important themes of the feminist movement from the 1970s onwards. And I think those themes are still really important. In some ways, in a parallel with First Nations people, a lot of women had children removed from them in the period before the 1970s, before women were given rights as mothers and access to an income as mothers to bring up their children as independent mothers by themselves without necessarily being part of the conjugal family. Those sorts of things were really important for women to have a real sense of themselves as independent people with rights and with the ability to bring up, with the respect of society, to bring up their own children rather than having to give them away to others.
What you were saying about the early 20th century, where women were fighting for the rights to be equal in the domestic sphere and to be protected in the domestic sphere, now their view is every sphere is ours as well. So the public sphere is ours, the workplace is ours, and we need equal representation. We need, and so there's a great effort in counting how many women are in each workplace, how many women are in Parliament, how many women are in each political party. So
and in executive positions.
Exactly. How many CEOs there? The push is, you know, our sphere is everywhere. As men have always said, it was theirs. And so we need to take our place there. And I think that's a big shift from the early 20th century, where many women were still saw their place as the domestic sphere and didn't push. And it was only really the wars, the Second World War, where women had to play a role in the wider sphere of employment and defence at the local level, that new possibilities were seen by them and by men and by society.
And ironically, the wars are interesting in that although theoretically women didn't have much say or power during the wars, in fact they gave them a great deal more confidence and access to the public sphere than they'd ever had before. And so after World War I, they may not have fought during the war, and they may not have been there except as nurses and doctors, even doctors not officially, but because they were the majority of the population at home, they spoke in public. Their views were taken seriously. They were the one of the few groups in the world among women who could vote, and so they were really important in terms of being talked to about the political powers. Conscription and elections, women were really important. So by the time you get into the 1920s and 30s, women's place in the public sphere is becoming much more acceptable. And Richard's right, World War II, even more so in terms of women's economic contribution to the war effort.
And then I think thereafter, the need for two incomes in a family to keep the family going further drew women into the workplace, and things like government policy where women were able to be educated at university free. And that was a huge thing, because the scholarship schemes to encourage women to be teachers, and then the Whitlam decision that all tertiary education is free, allowed women whose fathers had previously been saying, no, education's not for you, it's for the boys. Partly, I can't afford to educate everyone, and this is the way of managing the budget, but there was no argument now because it was free. And this was incredibly liberating for women, as it was for country students in general, men and women who were able to come to the city, board in hostels, become teachers, get an education, being the first in their family to have a degree.
And being enabled to work after they married as well. One of the interesting things was in the public service, including in the teaching profession, married women had to resign as soon as they married and couldn't be part of the workforce. Once that prohibition was lifted, it made work much more accessible to women, and it meant that family incomes could be dual incomes.
Which was then able to embrace the consumer revolution of the post-war period, where you needed all these things in your house. TVs were coming in, you needed domestic appliances, they cost money, and two incomes could purchase them. And the car. The Holden, the humble Holden car or the Ford could be in the garage if you had two incomes.
And it meant second wave feminism was relevant to most women by that stage. It wasn't just the young women who wanted sexual liberation. It was relevant to all women, because once married women could also be part of the workforce, then they started to be able to fight for their rights within the workplace as well, and to become much more important and dominant within the workplace.
Well, in short, I'd say do it, because if you're passionate about something, no matter what it is, you're going to do your best that you can do in that subject. And so if it's just a high ATAR you're aiming at, you're going to probably have a better chance of a great mark with doing something you're passionate about. So if it's history, yeah, and history's not easy. It's a challenge to do it, but I think people that embrace that challenge will do well. And then they need to know that history can be applied to a multiplicity of jobs. It can train you, for instance, to be Prime Minister of Australia. It can train you to be a policy advisor to that Prime Minister. It can train you to be a speechwriter to a Prime Minister, and historians have often done that, Don Watson being one of them. So then it can train you to be an advisor in the public service to that minister. And so it fulfills a whole range of job skills that you might never in any way think you're practicing history, but with the analysis that you're doing in lots of jobs, you will be doing that. If you want to go into filmmaking, you need a sense of what Australian society and culture is to choose the stories to tell. And often those stories that you're going to tell on film were created by a historian. They often create the foundational information. So look, I think it is for a wide range of jobs. Would you agree, Judy?
Well, absolutely. And I think that if you're interested in archaeology, if you're interested in museum studies and work in museums and in libraries, I think history is wonderful training for that too. And it enables people who want to go into those fields to pursue particular areas of history that they're interested in. People who work in archives just absolutely love being able to sort of dive deep into historical periods that they might have been superficially interested in, but then become experts on. Not because they're going to write books on the subject, although they might, but because that's part of their work and part of their contribution to the studies, their contribution to the research of other people as well. So there are many ways in which people can use a history degree or use historical studies and keep on pursuing their interests. I think policymakers is another area. Because you're only going to be a good policymaker if you can understand something about the historical context in which that policy is being developed.
And lawyers.
And lawyers too.
A lot of law is based on precedents and the case law before it. And that understanding that case law is about understanding the historical context that created that. So a lot of law students used to do history in their arts law degree, and often they said to me, well, this is more interesting than what I'm doing over the other place. So we helped get a lot of lawyers through their degree, I think, by giving them something that they really enjoyed.
I can think of one who studied the Chinese in colonial Victoria and then became a lawyer and has since pursued immigration law, has become an expert in immigration law and has written on child migration using her historical skills.